танкист должен быть выносливым, спокойным, решительным и красивым.
A Soviet showpiece of the 1930s. Outdated and outclassed. An American engineer and businessman in the late 1920s, Walter Christie holds the esteemed title of being the brainchild for the BT tanks. In the late 1920s, Christie experimented with tracked vehicles, and in 1928 released the Christie Model 1928. This tank was highly innovative, with an internal spring suspension with large diameter road wheels, but most importantly, the tank could drive without tracks. This design was a huge draw to many countries, including Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Christie could not get any interest out of his American generals. The Soviet Union initially was denied purchase of the tank due to poor Soviet-American relations in the late 1920s. However, they were eventually able to purchase some tanks and ship them to the USSR. After an evaluation period, the tank was accepted for production with some minor changes to the design. The new Soviet AFV was called the BT-2. This tank had a one-man turret which initially had a 37mm B3 gun, the first 60 of which differed majorly from the main production type. The bow slightly changed and different road wheels were manufactured. It was powered by an American 45V 12-cylinder 4-stroke engine. In all, 620 BT-2s were manufactured between 1931 and 1932. The vehicle on screen now, however, is highly unusual due to the PS-1 gun in the turret. This appears to be the only example of this type. Sometime into production, it was clear that the production of the B3 gun was not matching the output of the tank, so a decision was made to produce a mount on the turret to attach two machine guns in the place of the main gun. There was a BT-3 produced, however the only real difference was the screw threading on the tank was changed from imperial to metric. The BT-2 was used in manoeuvre units all the way up until Barbarossa, although it was technically decommissioned from Red Army service in 1940. Some BT-2s were upgraded with M17 petrol engines. These tanks had the old round exhaust replaced with two exhaust pipes protruding from the engine air intake grille. The BT-2 was hopelessly outclassed on the outset of World War II, and most were lost in the first months of war. The BT-4 has a rather interesting story to tell. The official Red Army records show us that it was an experimental tank which had a welded hull rather than a riveted one. However, there does appear to be some photoshopped images of BT-5s and BT-2s with two T-26 turrets. This appears to be a figment of the imagination, and so far all photos have not been verified and some have been thrown out as fake. In 1933, the BT-5 tank was put into production. This tank was similar to the BT-2, but now had a two-man turret with a 45mm K20 gun. The original turret was cylindrical, with a small stowage box at the rear. This turret was shared with the T-26, and was constructed very similarly to the T-35 45mm gun turrets. 230 tanks were produced with this turret configuration before a new turret was made with a bustle. As with the T-26, roughly 1 in 5 tanks was issued with a radio. 1,885 BT-5s were produced between 1933 and 1934. Some tanks were fitted with P-40 anti-aircraft mounts, but these were incredibly rare. More common, however, was the upgrade to a 45mm Model 1934 gun. Again, the BT-5 was upgraded with the M17 engine to improve performance. The BT-5 was outclassed at the outset of World War II. The need to keep the armour protection down to keep the speed up meant the tank was very under-armoured. However, it was incredibly fast. The BT tank were roughly the same size as the German Panzer III. The BT-7 tank was the next evolutionary step forward. Production started in 1934, and 4,760 tanks were produced up until 1939. The tank itself was a huge upgrade on the BT-5, with an entirely new hull, which was welded and now rounded at the bow, with a driver's compartment included. The rear of the tank was now sloped and did not have a recess at the rear for the old exhaust pipe. All tanks were produced with the M17 engine up until the BT-7M. As these propaganda images show, the tank was very fast and very manoeuvrable, but like all the BT tanks, the armour protection was poor. So, in 1937, BT-7 started being produced with a conical turret to help the armour protection. Very late into production, the BT-7M, sometimes called the BT-8, was produced. This tank had a V2 diesel engine, and is normally discernible by either the rear-facing machine gun in the turret, and sometimes a P-40 anti-aircraft mount. In addition to this, 134 BT-7A artillery tanks were produced. These had a new turret with a KT-28 76.2mm gun. 11 tanks were also issued with radio sets. The first combat usage of the BT tanks was during the Spanish Civil War, where they performed poorly, being soft targets for anti-tank guns. However, the premature swan song of the BT tanks was in the Battle of Calacan Gol and the 1939 Russo-Japanese War. BT tanks made up the majority of the Soviet AFV force in the Far East, and successfully destroyed the Japanese armoured force, causing Japan to sign an armistice. The BTs, however, were fatally outclassed by Barbarossa, and most were lost early. However, there is still BT tanks in service on the Western Front up until 1944, fighting in the Leningrad sector. Although not the greatest tank to have ever been produced, the BT tanks were an important part of the tank story. Its speed was something that many tanks have tried to copy over the years. The tank's mobility was very excellent. However, the only feature practically unique to the BT tanks, and was never reproduced, was the track-to-wheel convertible drive. This unfortunately proved to be too unreliable. The Soviet BT series should never be overlooked when reviewing armoured warfare.